Okay. Cool. All right. So, as much as possible, we will sort of be trying and covering mindfulness-based interventions today. So, mindfulness-based interventions, the way that so mindfulness-based interventions is called the third wave cognitive interventions or cognitive behavior therapy interventions. Okay. What I will do today is that we will first look at the definition of mindfulness. What is mindfulness? Where it comes from? And we'll also look at in what ways are these ideas of mindfulness integrated into one-on-one psychotherapy. Okay. All right. So mindfulness is defined. Um, it has its roots in Buddhism. So it has these Pali words sati and sampagyana, which means awareness, circumspection, discernment, and retention. Right. So it's really hard to sort of encapsulate mindfulness in the English language because it requires us to have an experiential sense of the word itself. However, all of these things, right? Awareness, circumspection, discernment, and retention are different aspects to mindfulness. Mindfulness is also defined as to remember to pay attention to what is occurring in one's immediate experience with care and discernment. I'll repeat that again. Mindfulness is to remember to pay attention to what is occurring in one's immediate experience with care and discernment. Now, one of the things that you should know about me is that in my practice, I'm primarily mindfulness focused. So social justice aware as well as mindfulness, which is the bedrock of the work that I do. So a lot of what I bring into our conversations is also coming from the years of work within the field of mindfulness. So the way that I might talk about how mindfulness is used in individual therapy through DBT as well as through ACT is primarily informed by by my work within mindfulness itself. All right. Other definitions of mindfulness: it is the practice of knowing what you're experiencing as you're experiencing it, without judging, evaluating, thinking, or changing it. Again, a big name within mindfulness, Christina Feldman, she described mindfulness within that definition of sati as simple knowing or awareness. So to see something without the usual distortions and attitude. So she sort of speaks about this idea of, that the fact that I have to say, a rose is a rose is a rose. I have to say it so many times so that you can sort of let go of these ideas or memories or other aspects of, what a rose represents and so forth, so that you can actually just see the bare bones of what a rose or what the object is in front of you. Right. So simple knowing or awareness is one of the ways in which mindfulness is defined. It's also called discernment. So discernment is learning to protect the mind from that which doesn't serve it well. So discernment is different from judgment. Judgment is an evaluation we make about our own lives as well as other people's lives. Discernment, however, is this way of looking at things, objects, circumstances, choices, and really reflecting on is it wholesome for me or not wholesome for me. Right? That's discernment. And then the other piece of mindfulness is investigative awareness. So it is this aspect of inquiry or experience itself. So when I am having an experience, to look at my experience as it is sort of unfolding is also another aspect of mindfulness. And then reframing cognition is another aspect of mindfulness. Reframing cognition, typically when you see something for what it really is, with an open, non-judgmental stance, with discernment, then you're able to have a sense of kindness towards whatever is showing up in the right now. Right. So those are the different aspects of mindfulness. Now, mindfulness can be defined both as a process as well as an outcome. What that means is that as a process, there are different practices within mindfulness that are typically present. So there are practices such as awareness of breath, body scan, and a variety of other practices that are primarily meditative practices. But there are also practices that are they're called informal practices. So any practice that helps you come back to the present moment with openness and presence, right? Like you're here, you're noticing what is happening in the right now towards an object that you have decided to pay attention to. That itself is a informal practice of mindfulness. So, so mindfulness is looked at as a process, but also as an outcome, in the sense that in my every moment, I can practice to keep coming back, and towards the end as well. That sort of mindful awareness that I have is an end product in itself as well. Okay. All right. Give me 1 second. Okay. So again, mindfulness has to be experienced to be known. Oftentimes, within the modality of the third wave practices, which includes mindfulness, there are a lot of workshops that happen for mental health practitioners because, of course, the belief as well as there has been enough documented evidence that when you do practice mindfulness, your presence also is nuanced, and as a result, what is sort of unfurling within the session, that also becomes nuanced, right? So mindfulness has to be experienced to be known. Uh, so within mindfulness, how we integrate into therapy can be thought of in three different ways. So mindfulness can be used as a way of sort of therapist training in essential skills, and these are skills of counseling, but also skills of self-care, moving beyond pathology. So that's called mindfulness-oriented psychotherapist. So me, I as a practitioner, I'm a mindfulness-oriented psychotherapist because I do use a lot of mindfulness in my own life as a way of um, sort of centering myself, but also as a way of sort of bringing presence into the space between me and the client. Okay, theoretical orientation. So I can use, it's called mindfulness informed psychotherapy, MIP, where I'm using theoretical aspects of mindfulness in my work as a talk therapist. And then clinical interventions, these are called mindfulness based psychotherapy, where the practitioners using different mindfulness approaches within the session itself. So mindfulness essentially can be used in all these different ways as a practitioner. And often the recommendation is to start with mindfulness oriented psychotherapy. A lot of practitioners will use clinical interventions as well, but it's highly recommended that you know what is the extent of the use of mindfulness within your own self in order to sort of be able to build the necessary attitudes required to be a mindfulness based psychotherapist. Now, give me 1 second. Yeah. All right. So there are, in terms of mindfulness based interventions, um, typically across internationally, mindfulness based interventions are 8-week programs or 5-day intensives. One of the first 8-week program that was developed, that was sort of taken from sort of the East and taken by John Kabat-Zinn, who was a physician. He developed this method called mindfulness-based stress reduction. Mindfulness-based stress reduction is again an 8-week program, one of the first programs that was developed that incorporates mindfulness and is used within medical settings as well as for chronic conditions. Right. So this is one of the it's called the first generation mindfulness-based intervention. Other mindfulness-based interventions that got developed for psychological purposes is called the mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. So MBCT is one of the approaches. So these two are called the first generation mindfulness-based interventions. After this, you have either after this or alongside actually this, practitioners began to sort of incorporate. So now 8-week mindfulness programs, what they typically do is that they're very didactic. They're experiential and didactic, and they're in group teaching formats. They're not group therapy. They're group teaching sessions or experiential sessions. So part experience, part teaching happens during these 8-week programs, and and however, you have practitioners who developed or took away aspects of mindfulness into individual work, right? Those are called, there are two of them that are quite extensively and exhaustively used. They're called, one is dialectical behavior therapy. We'll talk about that today. And then the other one is called acceptance and commitment therapy. All right. Just coming back a little bit to mindfulness-based interventions. Like I said, the first generation of mindfulness-based interventions were mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. The second generation mindfulness-based interventions are mindfulness-based symptom management, the program that I conduct. Right at Pause, you have 8-week programs as well as 5-day intensives that that are primarily MBSM based programs. Then you have other programs called mindfulness and self compassion, as well as you have other programs such as mindfulness informed CBT and so forth, which are called second generation mindfulness based interventions. Okay, these are some of the practices of these are some of the practices that are meditative practices that are typically used within all mindfulness-based intervention programs. So concentration practice, open awareness, loving kindness and compassion practice are often practices that we are using during the 8-week programs. Okay. All right. So some of the, like I said, mindfulness informed psychotherapy. So when I'm using the theoretical aspects of mindfulness, I'm using it in talk therapy. Um, the two in mindfulness informed psychotherapy programs are ACT as well as DBT. Okay. All right. Now we're going to look at ACT, but I'm actually wondering if you have any questions. I've stopped the recording. Just wondering if you have any questions I can answer at this point in terms of for mindfulness itself. Anybody have questions? Is that all clear? What mindfulness is?
Ma'am, so mindfulness is about being in the here and now, like in the session itself. Like, for example, when a client is like when you say, what are you feeling right now, and breathe a little and all, is that also a part of mindfulness where you want them to be aware of how they're feeling in the current moment?
So, when mindfulness is used within psychology, we look at um, how we can help people build awareness to different platforms of their experience. So, there are 4 platforms that we can have a psychological experience, and those are sort of body, emotions, sensations, and thoughts. So, in therapy, when we are inviting people to get mindful, we are getting them to look at what is happening in the body, what's happening in the emotions, sensations, and thoughts. So, what are they noticing, and how are they feeling towards what they're noticing? And if they can have a non-judgmental stance around what it is that they're noticing. Those are the different aspects of mindfulness that are introduced in psychological spaces. Um, and as to your definition of mindfulness, yes, bringing attention to the present moment um, with non-judgmental awareness, right? That's what is sort of overall the definition of mindfulness as well. Okay.
Thank you.
In psychology, we are bringing attention to either body, emotion, sensations, or thoughts non-judgmentally. Okay, but how that sort of unfolds, we can look at through ACT as well as DBT. Okay. Any other questions?
Ma'am, so we can use like anything to be mindful, right? We'll have different people might have different approaches to being mindful of what they're going through, right? Or is it only like we follow something to be mindful?
Can you say that again?
Um, so different people might be using different ways of being mindful. Like something might be working for me, and something else might be working for another person. So we do have different things or different ways to be mindful, right? It's not just only one way that we follow to be mindful.
No, that's not a single way. Um, Now, a lot of people, I mean, so that's the thing, right? Like, I don't know uh, how much you know about mindfulness, but mindfulness as a word, it's such a lay word that one can assume that there are that um, that it means um, whatever, right? Like it means being present, and it can be used in any which way. It can be used through any means. However, as a psychologist, when you're talking about mindfulness, you do need to get aware of what are the edges of mindfulness. What are we saying when we talk about mindfulness? So for that, right, like this, like some 5 slides I showed you about mindfulness, those are barely enough. I didn't even go into the definition of mindfulness. So that's not adequate in order to help you understand what are the edges of and what is the stretch of mindfulness. What are we saying when we are saying we practice mindfulness? I haven't covered that yet, and I don't intend to cover that in this session. What I do plan to do is tell you what ACT is, tell you what DBT is, and we can take it from there, right? But mindfulness as uh, in order to just answer your question, it's right. There is no one way of practicing informal mindfulness. There are several ways to practice informal mindfulness. But what are we saying is the definition really is mindfulness different from flow, for instance? Is mindfulness different from a gratitude practice, for instance? Those are discernments that we need to make and that we can't make in a class like today. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Any other question?
Ma'am, no question, but for me, when you said mindfulness, the first thing that came to my mind was meditation.
Yeah, it is one of the things. It's not the only thing, but it's definitely like if you are a mindfulness practitioner or you do one of the 8-week programs, you will be doing a mindfulness practice, which is a meditation practice for like every week, at least one practice is introduced. But it's not the only thing about mindfulness. Yeah.
Yes.
Ma'am, actually, as you were talking on this mindfulness, like in a solution focused therapy also, we focus here and now and what the client is going through, what the client is really in reality experiencing at present now. So, in that way, how we can distinguish between when we use the technique of being aware and here and now in mindfulness therapy and solution focused or problem focused.
Wait, I didn't understand, Amla. Can you say that again?
In other therapies too, like a solution focused therapy, for example, we focus on here and now, what the person is going through in the present.
Mm.
This is what somehow is in similar to mindfulness, where we focus at in the present.
No, no, it's very different. So mindfulness is it's called a top-down. Sorry, it's called the bottom-up approach, which means that it's very different from any talk therapy that you have been introduced to. Now, all talk therapy is introduced. It's talk therapy, right? So the idea is that you start from the cognition, you talk about the mind, and then you bring stress, you reduce the stress, right? However, with mindfulness, it is a bottom up approach in the sense that you're working with the body, right? You're working with sensations of the body. You're working with regulating, noticing the sensations and what is happening and regulating the sensations in the body, and then arrive at cognitions and changing cognitions. Not even changing. We don't even look at changing cognitions in mindfulness-based therapies. We'll talk a little bit about that, but it is very, very different from, definitely not the same as solution focus. Solution focus is not a present moment. It is present and future. It's very future focused. It's not at all past focused. Most psychodynamic modalities, for instance, are past focused, past and present focused. SFBT is present and future focused. Narrative is, yes, there is a little bit of past in narrative, but they're also present and future focused in a very sort of strength based way, right? Mindfulness, however, is very present focused, and the present focus is not just on the narrative or the story of the client. It is constantly on bringing awareness, like I said, to body, emotions, sensations, and thoughts. In mindfulness, the definition of emotion is very different. In mindfulness, well, it's the same definition everywhere, but um, it's not seen in the same way in mindfulness. So mindfulness, they talk about emotions as a cluster of sensations that is happening in the body, right? So if it is happening in the body, then I'm noticing it in the body, right? And if I'm noticing it in the body, then I'm regulating it in the body. I'm not changing thoughts to regulate how I'm feeling about different things, right? So in that sense, mindfulness is a very bottom up approach, and it is very different from any other modality. In mindfulness, we're primarily looking at what is the nervous system feeling, right? What's happening in the nervous system, and how do we want to feel in the nervous system. Yeah, I mean, that's what I can say right now, I think.
Thank you, ma'am. It clears actually now. Means some clarity is there.
Yeah. Okay. A lot of other modalities, like for instance, existential therapy is very present focused as well. Gestalt is very present focused. Um, Gestalt actually does use a little bit of body, and they use a little bit of what is happening in the right now, and yet it is different from mindfulness as an intervention. Yeah, yeah. So what we are going to do is, I'm going to only show you what ACT as a modality, as well as what dialectical behavior therapy as a modality looks at. Um, what these folks have done. So Stephen Hayes is one of the developers of acceptance commitment therapy. Stephen Hayes looks at, he incorporates aspects of mindfulness into his structure of ACT therapy, which I'll demonstrate. I'll show it to you. But yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a sort of unwieldy, heavy subject to hold. We'll see what we can do with it. Okay. All right. So we're looking at acceptance and commitment therapy. You are you guys able to? Okay, I'm just gonna share. You're able to see the screen, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. So there are 6 core processes to acceptance and commitment therapy. It's demonstrated through this hexaflex. All right. So the first core process, or one of the core processes, is acceptance. You have diffusion. You have values, committed action, contact with the present moment, and self as context. These are the 6 core processes of acceptance and commitment therapy, right? And we'll look at what they mean in a minute. All right. So the idea, with ACT is that, if you're able to work with these 6 core processes that an individual experiences, then they are able to achieve psychological flexibility. The goal, according to ACT, of therapy and work in therapy is to help individuals experience psychological flexibility. So you see that the hexaflex is all connected to one another. The idea is that once you start working with one core value, the other ones loosen up, and you are actually also working with other core values when you're using one itself. What you choose to start with depends on the person, depends on your style of working. All right. Now, there are again two ways to look at these 6 core processes. Now, these aspects, right, contact with the present moment, acceptance, diffusion, self as a context, they are all called the acceptance and mindfulness processes. All right. And then you have these aspects: contact with the present moment, self as context, committed actions and values. These are called commitment and behavior change processes. So you have both the acceptance and mindfulness process and commitment and behavior change processes that are part of the acceptance and commitment therapy. All right. Again, another way to look at these 6 core values, 6 core processes, is that acceptance and diffusion are called practices in letting go. Contact with the present moment and self as a context are practices in showing up. Values and committed action are practices in get moving. So you can see sort of the stance of acceptance and commitment therapy is to PPT, no?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
So ACT is based on what is called the relational frame theory. So most approaches are either heavy on techniques or also directly based on theory itself. So ACT is based on what is called the relational frame theory. Now, what it says is that what they are looking at as problems to mental health is that they're saying language is the problem that leads to human suffering, right? So they're saying that language, of course, is both useful and problematic. Language is at the core of psychological disorders and human suffering. An ACT is designed to see the context in which language occurs than the content. Now, it takes a little while to sort of go through what this means, and let me sort of share with you. If you think about it, right, like how did language evolve? Language typically evolved. It started off as people sort of noticing and pointing out at objects, right? So you have danger, right, like an animal, or look out, or be careful, or whatever, right? Like, or you have to point out to food, yeah, food or milk or whatever, right? So language developed as a way of sort of identifying your environment, helping people stay safe, all of those things. However, the interesting piece is that while language evolved to help you denote what is happening in the surroundings, what is safe, what is not safe, it helped you communicate these things. When language began to be used for one's own internal mental sort of aspects, right? For an individual's thoughts, behaviors, and so forth, that's when the problem started to occur. Then things like sadness became something that was unpleasant. Things like happiness became something that was pleasant, right? So we started giving language to our internal experience, and in giving language to our internal experience, we started having preferences about what we want and what we don't want. And according to ACT, that is essentially the problem um, of people who have mental health issues. They say that language is at the core of psychological disorders. Now think about it, right? Like there is a certain depressive rumination that happens for individuals with uh, with with depression, right? So people are going to talk about certain things in a certain way, and here they're talking about language not just as words but also images and symbolic representations, right? So it can be drawings or sign language is language as well. So all sorts of language that entails expression of internal aspects and internal sort of happenings became problematic, and also are at the core of human suffering. That's essentially what ACT practitioners say. ACT is then designed to see the context in which language occurs than the content itself. Now, CBT, for instance, you guys already know about CBT. CBT is looking at, if the person says I'm a loser, then no, why are you talking about you being a loser? Give me the proof for why you're a loser, proof for why you are not a loser. And then given that, there is equal or actually more sort of evidence to the fact that you're not a loser, how can we have thoughts that we can sort of restructure? That is what CBT is about, right? However, with ACT, what they're saying is that notice that this thought has arrived, right? Notice if this thought is wholesome or not, right? And let go of that thought and work towards what is really important to you. That's essentially the sort of crux of ACT. So ACT is not at all saying, go into that thought and dig into the thought and change the thought. ACT is saying, notice the context in which this language is occurring, and then work with that versus the content itself. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about this going forward. Now, we spoke about how the goal of ACT is psychological flexibility, right? What is psychological flexibility? The ability to contact the present moment more fully as a conscious human being, and to either change or persist when doing so serves valued goals. Okay, so it's really important here. I'll repeat that a little bit. The goal of psychological flexibility. What does psychological flexibility mean? It is the ability to contact the present moment more fully as a conscious human being. So presence is there. You want to come into the present moment as a conscious human being and either change or persist. So either you change or you continue to do what you do. When doing so, serves valued goals. So valued goals, again, is at the core of acceptance and commitment therapy. Again, it'll start to sort of make sense as we continue to do this work. Okay. ACT seeks to alter the function of the form or relational networks, and consequently, there's no need to remove these historically conditioned responses before progress is made. Now, this is very powerful, right? Like all of psychology as we know it till your class today is about how if you change the past, if you change the way past is thought about, if you change something within sort of the conditioned responses of the past, then progress will be made. However, ACT is saying no, they're not connected, right? Those things can continue to keep happening. You can continue to keep moving on. That is essentially what ACT is saying. All right. It uses relatively non-linear form of language, relied on metaphors, stories, exercises, behavior tasks, and experiential processes. Limited role of direct instruction and logical analysis. Again, another very powerful sort of intervention with that. It does not use this sort of linear form of language where you're sitting and confronting a client, getting them to look at what is happening in their sort of mind about different kinds of thought processes. All they're doing is sometimes introducing a metaphor. They're introducing exercises. They're introducing experiential processes that help you switch out of this sort of logical analysis and have sort of an experience of the present moment. That is essentially what ACT is doing. The point is not to establish a new belief system, but a more effective approach to language itself. Again, very important, right? Like the point is not, it's not like, any modality again that says, these belief systems are core negative thoughts. Can we change them? No, ACT is saying, you know what, it's not about establishing a new belief system. Just learn to sort of approach the way in which you talk differently. Okay. All right, I showed you the 6 core processes already. All right. Now we're going to sort of unpack each of these processes. Okay. That's a lot of fun for me. I hope that you will start to enjoy some of these aspects as well. So acceptance is, the definition is to take what is offered. Okay. But it's not tolerance or resignation. Tolerance and resignation are fatalistic and passive. Right? Acceptance, however, is non-judgmental awareness and actively embracing the experience of thoughts, feelings, and bodily sensations as they occur. Now, this is the biggest aspect of mindfulness that people constantly miss. And, the aspect is that it is about non-judgmental awareness, right? Non-judgmental awareness and active embracing of what not of circumstances. We're not saying accept that somebody slapped you, right? Accept that like a horrible thing has happened to you. That's not what acceptance is about in the context of act psychological processes. What we are saying that we need to open up to and have as an experience is what is happening in terms of your thoughts, feelings, bodily sensations as they are occurring, right? So any sensations as they're occurring, any thoughts that they're occurring as they are, any feelings you're having at the moment, to be able to open into it and actively embrace it. That's the work of acceptance in acceptance and commitment therapy. All right. By promoting acceptance, we are promoting acceptance by contacting the cost of control when control is inappropriately applied to private events. Again, an excellent sentence. I will unpack it for you. What essentially they're saying is that, you know, like let's say a certain machine, right? Certain machine is not working. Your door is not working because the hinges have gotten rusted. What do you typically do? You put some grease on it and then it works, right? So you have some control over sort of how to make that machine work. However, your private events, like the emotions that are arising, the thoughts and feelings that are arising, they will just occur, right? They don't function. Our internal private events don't function as brick and mortar. They don't function as the hinge of your door where you know put some oil and the rest will go away, right? Your thoughts will show up. If you control those thoughts, they only get worse, right? So what ACT is saying is control is the problem, it's not the solution, right? So there is a metaphor in ACT. The metaphor is called room full of duct tape. You know what a duct tape is, right? It's a cellophane tape, basically, those thick tapes. So the metaphor is that, you know, there's a hole on your roof and water is sort of coming in. You just put one duct tape and cover it. And what will happen for temporarily, it will stop. And then बाजू में से again water will start leaking, and then you put another duct tape to it, and then you put another, and then you put another. So the room is full of duct tape, and you think that the water is prevented from falling into your house. What will eventually happen? The roof will finally give, right? It will all break down. So he says, basically, he in the sense that, you know, ACT practitioners, Stephen Hayes is who I'm thinking about at the moment, but ACT practitioners tell you that sort of sticking stuff and thinking you're controlling it and pushing things away is actually the problem and it's not the solution, right? And you will see this happen, right? When you have disturbing thoughts, do a distraction strategy. Great, it's fixed, and you don't have to ever come into thinking about your thoughts. That's not always the case, right? You are distracted, that's great. You will use music, you will use whatever, right? And they're important. We're not saying distraction strategies are not important. We're saying it's like the room full of duct tape, it's not enough. So you might control it for a little bit, but it's not the solution. So what they're talking about is that control is unworkable when applied to private events like feelings and thoughts. They're very workable in other areas. You know, it's very workable to sort of put grease on your hinges of the door and sort of make it work really well. You know, it's very easy to sort of fix something and, you know, make it all work well. It is not possible to sort of control the feelings and thoughts that come into your mind. The problem, essentially what ACT is saying, is that OCD as an issue, depression as an issue, anxiety as an issue comes because you're trying to control private events of feeling and thinking certain way. The pain of not being able to solve this conundrum, right? Like typically what we want to do, how do we get clients to see, or get clients, how do we entertain people to think about acceptance as a strategy? um, One of the things is that you talk to them about the cost of control, right? So I'll give you an example of a client. I have a client who I've had a client for a while who has a lot of anxiety. They work in this really good MNC, extremely successful space. They have a fairly good position, but constantly rattled by social anxiety. So every time they have to go into a meeting and do a presentation, 2 weeks is essentially lost in sort of that anxiety of prep. So they're preparing, and then preparing some more. And what they're losing as a result of so much prep work is time from their partner, focus on other tasks, creativity, and a lot of other things because of their social anxiety, right? And yet they go into the room, they do a fabulous job, and yet they're feeling extremely anxious, and they're like, होने के बाद अच्छा हो गया, बस हो गया, मेरे को नहीं करना है और कुछ. And then they're sitting in relief, and then they're thinking about the next issue that they need to tackle with, right? So when I ask them, okay, what have you tried to work with this social anxiety that you have, this anxiety of presentation and so forth, they tell me, I spent 2 weeks practicing. I spent 2 weeks and then I have a fabulous presentation. Does that work for you? Yeah, it works for me. I mean, I'm doing a great job, right? Like I have gotten several promotions. I am presenting still. I am standing. I'm not crumbling. That's why this works for me. 2 weeks of sort of putting pressure. Okay, then why are you here, right? Like this strategy is working. Cool. No, it's not enough because I know that if I'm going to be promoted again, meetings are going to be some things that will happen every single day. Presentations are something I need to go to every other week. I can't, like, I don't have time. Like, time of 2 weeks prep, I don't have that time anymore. I can't do this anymore. So, the cost of control, right? Like, I'm controlling my social anxiety from showing up in a certain way by spending 2 weeks of sort of stressful time on it. That the cost of such a control is starting to become very heavy on this client, right? And he's saying, it's, I'm not enjoying this. I'm at the brink of sort of burnout if I continue to do this anymore, right? So typically what we are doing in therapy is, when people say, I want this thing to go away, anything they say, typically you'll have your clients say, I want my symptoms to go away. And then you sort of indulge in that conversation. Okay, what have been the different things that you have tried so far? And they will tell you all the things that they have tried so far. And I'll say, okay, if this is working, distraction is working, prep for 2 weeks is working, all of this is working, you're doing fine, right? Like, why, there is nothing else to try other than this. And they talk about how this is not enough, and they are burning out if they continue to, this is not sustainable basically. That is when I introduce the idea of control as the problem and not the solution, right? And when I sort of introduce that idea, um, essentially they're asking me, they come to this place called creative hopelessness, right? This is a place where they're saying, okay, I don't know what to do, right? Tell me, what can I do in this situation, right? When they have tried everything and I said, okay, go back and use this, and they're saying, no, I don't want to use this, it's not helping me. When I introduce, and then I introduce the idea that, what, that kind of control has been the problem, it's not the solution. They say, okay, what shall I do then? They have to internally, you have to feel like they're ready to move into the next stage of acceptance and commitment, right? And I'll talk to you a little bit about what that is. But before that, the pain of not being able to solve this conundrum is linked to an accepting message. This is not the client's fault. It's a rigged game and we can walk away, right? Somebody is, yeah, just unmuted. So essentially what I'm saying is then you don't have to play this game, right? So, there's another metaphor, tug of war metaphor. This is, if we were in class together, I would have done this metaphor with you all. Yes, 1 second, give me 1 second. All right, sorry folks. Okay. All right, so there is another metaphor that I was telling you. If you guys were in class, I would have done it. Basically, it's the tug of war metaphor. So if you have one of your chunnis, I typically have people who weigh the same, somewhat the same on both sides, and I'll ask both sides to sort of play tug of war with me, right? And if you're sort of weighing the same, that tug of war. It's like a rigged game, right? Like there is no give. On one hand, the anxiety is sort of pulling you. On the other hand, all your control strategies are pulling you, and you're stretched thin, right? Um, Typically with this metaphor, I'll say, what else is the choice here? And then I'll say, let go of that truth, right? And the idea of letting go is that we are accepting that control is the problem. It's not the solution. And that the game itself is rigged, right? Like we think that we are supposed to make this anxiety go away. That is a rigged game, and that we can walk away from a game like that. Okay. All right. So I spoke to you guys about this right now. So how do we work with acceptance as a process? We look at confronting the change agenda. So I challenge clients on, you know, what have you tried to make your, this difficult sort of symptom go away? And when they tell me that they've tried all of these things, that then I introduce the fact that, control is the problem, it's not the solution. Then they experience what is called creative hopelessness. um, in um, in IV as well. Now it's called new something. No, what's it called? It's called something in IV within that confrontation chapter. um I can't remember, new hope or something like that. Nonetheless,
Creating the new, just the new.
just the new. Yeah, it's called creating the new. So similar, right? Like creative hopelessness is this place where I start to realize that with my agenda of trying to control my issue has never worked for me. I guess there needs to be another way. So creative hopelessness is not just like terrorizing hopelessness and nothing is going to work and I will jump right into another depressive episode. It's actually more creative. It is this sort of openness to explore what else can I do, right? Clients are fused with catastrophic outcomes of feeling depressed or anxious that acceptance is not even in the realm of imaginable experience, right? So this is the issue with people that do experience destabilizing symptoms, right? That if I allow these symptoms to be, then I will experience worse depression and anxiety. That this idea of acceptance is not even present, and yet the problem is that, right, like then they end up sort of this horrible tug of war with a monster where you can never win, right? And the interesting thing here, right, like psychological health is equated to absence of distress and unwanted private content, right? So much of your psychopathology teaches you how psychological distress is unwanted and it's not okay, and it's equated to unhealthy, it's equated to mental illness, right? So the dark message that we're giving is that private events, negative private content is toxic and dangerous and must be controlled in the name of psychological health, which is extremely wrong, right? The assumption is that healthy people can control and eliminate negative private content and gain psychological health. Again, that assumption is false. We all are capable of all kinds of thoughts. However, this sort of equating psychological health to absence of distress has become the biggest issue. And it's not the fact that I actually have negative thoughts present. Yeah. So how do you work with this sort of unworkable change agenda? Now, what is the unworkable change agenda? So I have, say, anxiety, right? The unworkable change agenda is just like that door is not opening because that hinge is sort of rusted, right? So what you do, you detect the negative problem, then you eliminate the cause, and then you eliminate the issue itself. That's how we work with doors that don't work well, right? But yet, unfortunately, we also work with the same way with what happens inside of our bodies to our thoughts. We think that detecting the cause of the negative content, eliminating the cause, will eliminate the issue itself, right? However, this backfires inside the skin, right? We cannot simply eliminate our history and the experience it contains, right? Pushing negative content, negative private content what that does is it increases negative private content, and that leads to destructive experiential avoidance to make the content go away. All this in the service of making the change agenda work and further giving control focused reasons as cause of life restricting behaviors. Right? And then we start saying things like, I didn't go to work because I was depressed. Depression exists, sadness exists. But because we are saying I have been a failure in working with depression and that this negative content should fully be eliminated, we start restricting our lives. Okay, this is the change agenda, and this agenda is unworkable. Trying to make things go away, trying to stop your thoughts, trying to stop and eliminate depression is not the answer, right? Which is why look at the sort of work ACT is doing, right? They're constantly helping you see this agenda is not working, right? Because we try to keep on pushing negative content, the negative content keeps coming up, right? And in order to further try to make this negative content go away, we end up indulging in destructive experiential avoidant behaviors. Okay, that makes sense. The change agenda says that cause must be removed or controlled for psychological health, but since cause cannot be removed, client is in a trap. Experiential control and avoidance are unhelpful. You'll get them, you as a therapist will get them to see it by getting them in contact with the costs of control and avoidance. This is what I was saying, right? Typically, you want to be able to say to people, you're not hopeless, your change agenda is hopeless. Control is the problem, it's not the solution. And then we're also wanting to, these are different ways to sort of enter that conversation, right? We have, what have you tried? How has it worked? What has it cost you? Right? And they also sort of truly believe that if you try to gain control of your feelings, you lose control of your life. All right. So what we want to be able to do, develop acceptance and willingness. Acceptance is active embracing the present moment fully and without defense. No one is willing all the time in all areas. Thus, no matter how willing, there is always more to do. And also, willingness is a choice to make undefended contact with psychological barriers in service of chosen values, right? Now, why should I simply time pass work on acceptance of something that I don't like? Right? It's not time pass, right? Like the idea is that now ACT truly believes that when you work towards, you want to be able to work towards active acceptance and willingness because of what it is that you truly want for yourself. All right. Now, how do you do it? All right, so other things, right? Key therapeutic messages. Willingness or acceptance is an alternative to emotional control and struggle. What would you have to accept to move your life towards what you value? Focus on what you can control and change your behavior and accept what you can't. Um, this is like that serenity prayer, right? Willingness is a choice, it's not a decision. Willingness is not wanting. Again, it's a very key piece. Willingness is not wanting. You don't have to want something to be willing to have it. Willingness is an action, it's a very active practice, and it's not feelings or thoughts. Okay, so we want to encourage people to have the willingness, practice the willingness to have the difficult thought, difficult feelings, difficult experience. Now, these are the different. So, how does ACT sort of introduce acceptance? It actually introduces acceptance as a skill through metaphors. It's very cool. Okay, there are different metaphors. And there's really fun metaphors. Quicksand metaphor. You know what a quicksand is, right? It's that sort of sand, wet sand that sort of sucks you in. The more you sort of struggle in it, so the quicksand metaphor, typically therapists will say, have you heard of the quicksand metaphor? The way that quicksand metaphor works is that you sort of fall in it. The more you struggle, the more it sucks you in. Do you know what is the sort of a way to get out of the quicksand? Does anybody know?
Stay still, stop moving, stop resisting.
Yeah. So the way to work around the quicksand is that you lie back on your back, and then you float to the edge of the quicksand and then roll over, right? And that's sort of with ACT, you just sort of, it's like mic drop. You just sort of drop this metaphor and have the person really think about what is it that they're experiencing. I spoke to you about room full of duct tape as well, right? Ball in a pool is a similar metaphor. Let's say there are lots of balls in a swimming pool, right? You're right in between all of it. You want to make it go away. They're not going away, right? You try to push it and you push it down and you push it down, and obviously the ball is going to sort of rise up. And your thoughts are like that ball, sort of you're trying to push it down and they're going to rise up. And all you can do is sort of wait it out. It'll flow out, it'll float out to the edge of the pool, and then you have your swimming pool to yourself. Now, another one is called Don't Think About a Puppy. So I'm going to have you guys do it. Don't think of a puppy. Don't think of the cutest, little, tiniest, sweetest, most adorable, beautiful baby, like big-eyed, innocent puppy. Right? Don't think about it. Don't think about the soft fur, the little yelping and wanting to sort of embrace you that it does. Don't think about all of that, you guys. That's not possible, right? All you're doing is thinking about the puppy or how to not think about the puppy. And yet the puppy is in your thoughts, right? So this is sort of the same thing. So it's a metaphor that where you want to establish that when you want something to go away and you keep pushing it and pushing it, it's actually not going to go away anywhere, right? So what you want to be, so there is this again elaborate thought card metaphor that I feel too exhausted to give you right now. We should be taking a break, but let me finish this one thing. So encouraging client to sit with it, make space for it, remain present, continue moving in the value direction. One of the things that I did with my client who spoke about their social anxiety in sort of presentation and stuff, I asked them, what do you feel in your body? Where do you feel it in your body? Think about that event and tell me what you're feeling right now, right? And they spoke about sort of sensations up their arms, a bit in their stomach, sensations, up and down their legs. And I said, what would it look like to make space for it? Just to imagine that, what, you're talking to that sensation and you're saying, you're allowed to be there for a little bit. I'll give you space. I have a big body. And just continue to breathe as you say that to these sensations. I got them to sit down and do that with me. And they said, what? Those sensations are decreasing. And I said, yeah, sometimes sensations will decrease, sometimes they will increase. But the more you are with it, you will see that they go in and out. That's one way to regulate. Now, that's the piece about mindfulness, right? I'm bringing mindfulness or a present moment as an experience. That's another core aspect or core skill of ACT, right? Present moment skill. So I'm saying, open up to what's happening in the body, make space for it in your body, say to yourself, sensations, you're allowed to be there. Just continue to be with your breath. And they report to me, this client reported to me, shifts. I did the thought card metaphor with him as well, which I can tell you a little bit later. Right? So to continue to do that work, right, and that's making space. So there are short mindfulness exercises and scripts that allow you to do this. That I can get the person to sit down as they're sitting with me. Once I introduce a metaphor, let's say quicksand metaphor, then they're like feeling all creative hopelessness. They're saying, okay, what do I do? I introduce present moment exercise and I say, what does it mean to notice your sensations with an open stance? And something shifts for them then. All right. Okay, let's take a small break. Core aspect of that. Right. The other one is called cognitive diffusion. So we looked at acceptance. We're now looking at cognitive diffusion. ACT aims to alter the context in which thoughts occur so as to decrease the impact and importance of difficult private event. Right. So the idea is that the
Pallavi, can you mute yourself?
Thank you. All right. Okay. So ACT acknowledges that when negative events, sort of negative private events hit us, what happens for us is that we feel that those are the only things that exist, for us. So when there is sort of negative rumination, we believe that that's all there is to life, right? Or when there is anxiety, that's the only sole thing that is present for us in our future, right? So what ACT aims to do is to sort of decrease the impact and importance of that event. So it doesn't change the content, it changes how you're relating to that event, to that internal negative private event. We'll talk about how in a moment. What happens for the client, however, is that the client fuses with verbal content. Now look at what's going on, right? Like ACT primarily believes that language is the issue that leads to mental health conditions that people experience, right? So what ACT is saying is happening for people is that the person fuses with verbal content, right? So how thoughts are being formed, how thoughts are, the content of the thoughts. So either verbally, through images, through urges, whatever, however, in whatever form, sort of verbal content occurs, or content itself occurs, content of the internal private event occurs. It says that the client is actually fusing with that content. That content can exercise complete dominance over the client's behavior. When fusion is combined with culturally supported messages that negative private events are toxic and not normal, a dangerous cycle is set in motion. So anxiety essentially becomes bad. And if anxiety and bad exist, then I also exist and I am bad happens. Right? So you see sort of this sort of vicious cycle of what happens when content is fused with. Right? So therapy goal in ACT with respect to cognitive fusion is to create distance between the thought and the thinker. Right? Now, how do they do that? Now, there are different exercises, and I've actually used a lot of these with the people that I work with. One is just notice what your mind is telling you right now, right? Is it a helpful thought? Is this a good use of my time? So to notice that becomes important. Notice the form of thought by describing it. Is it word, sound, picture? What does it sound like? So thinking about and nuancing into sort of the form of thought can be an interesting exercise. To just constantly say it out loud that this is an interesting thought, right? And that's all it is. This is an interesting thought. To acknowledge the thought, but just say, oh, that's an interesting thought. That's all, right? Now, there is a difference between buying a thought and having a thought. And what typically happens with cognitive fusion is that you buy into the thought. It's not just having a thought anymore, right? So often ACT also says, start labeling your thoughts. I'm having the thought that, instead of saying that you think this is going to happen, to say, I'm having this thought, or I think that, instead of saying this is going to happen, right? So how much you're fused also depends on how you say it, right? So to try to change that is important. The other piece is saying it slowly. So I have actually done this exercise. What I've done with clients is that I've asked them to, so with clients with, say, let's say, ruminative, depressive sort of narrative, I get them to write down all the thoughts that are coming up about your depression, about your situation, about you in this present moment. So typically, I've had people write an entire sheet. And I say, once you have written it, read it out to me. Once they read it, I'll ask them, what are you feeling right now? I feel heavy, I feel sad, I feel very bothered about my circumstance. Okay, write that also. Okay, and then what I say, now sing it to the tune of ABCD, right? So whatever script they have written, I get them to sing it to the tune of ABCD, right? And then I say, read it really fast, right? Like an insurance disclaimer, read it that fast, right? Read it really slowly, sing it like an opera singer. So, by the time I'm at sort of read it, sing it as a happy birthday song or an ABC song, they're starting to crack up in between sort of that entire document. And I still kind of pursue that conversation. I say, no, sing it now, or I say, come on, let's do it as an opera singer, or something else like an insurance disclaimer. And there is laughter in the room, right? You have to remember that it has to be done with a lot of respect, right? It's not to sort of dismiss the fact that you're having these thoughts, or it's not to dismiss the fact that um, these thoughts exist. The reality is that these thoughts exist, but sort of what we are trying to do here is diffusing it a little bit, creating some distance between the thought and the thinker, right? So typically I do it with clients I've known for a long time. I've already worked on other techniques like mindfulness, having the thought, experiencing the thought in the body, allowing it to stay present. We walk with those thoughts. We might do a couple of exercises, and then I might come to cognitive diffusion and then get them to do this, right? Then you have thank your mind. So every time sort of the mind sort of throws up these thoughts, you say thank you mind, thank you for those thoughts. I instead will do what I believe is important for me, right? Now, all of this also requires that willingness, active willingness. Yeah, but how long will it work? Continue to keep doing it, right? Keep noticing you, because we have 80,000 thoughts in a day or something like that. And if you have like most of your thoughts are problematic thoughts and that's what you're noticing, we need to practice a little bit, right? So that's essentially what I'm getting them to do with some of these techniques. So there is a story for everything. What is the story in service of? How old is the story? If you're 100% correct, how does that help you? If you buy into the story, what does that do to you? And what happens next? These are some of sort of the inquiries to hold on to with thoughts, and notice that it's not about the content anymore. They're not saying, Acha, if you think you're a loser, then what? They're still saying, no, this thought. Already we are diffusing and we're sort of stepping away from the thought when we say this thought or this sort of negative private event that is happening for you right now. And in that already we're stepping away from sort of the toxicity of the content itself. Now, traditional CBT uses interventions to alter relational networks. So, for something like I will always be a failure, CBT says, aren't you sometimes a success? Are you saying you must be a failure? Let's test that and see. Oh, this is overgeneralization. That is irrational. What is evidence for it? What is a failure anyway? This is black and white thinking. This is what CBT does, right? So from an RFT, relational frame theory, the theory that is informed, that ACT is informed by, from an RFT point of view, we worry about that strategy, since these kinds of interventions could elaborate and complicate the network and paradoxically increase the functions of negative thoughts. They're saying CBT, actually we're worried about sort of interventions within CBT. What they are saying, in ACT, we attempt to diminish unhelpful control. So for something like I will be a failure, the interventions are the thought card exercise, which I haven't told you about. I'll tell you in a moment. And thank your mind for that thought. What if that thought was an object? What would it look like? Can we say I'm having that thought that I will always be a failure? Say failure 100 times. When you say failure 100 times, right? That word becomes very fuzzy, right? We are not saying failure anymore. We're saying some nonsense, right? It's okay to have that. Is it okay to have that thought? If that thought were in a room, where would it be? Right? So control is not the solution. In fact, it is a large part of the problem. That's essentially what ACT is sort of going for. All right. Okay, the thought card exercise. Let's kind of do it. I want to sort of demonstrate the thought card exercise. So as you're looking at me, imagine if you have a book in front of you. I'd pick up that book, right? I don't have a book in front of me. I hope you have a book in front of you. There it is. Let's say this book, you open a page of that book. That page is full of your negative problems, right? Place it in front of you. I can pause recording so that I can see you all. Now the next piece of the core aspect of ACT, it's the self as the context. Now we have this one sort of defined sense of self. No, it's called the conceptualized self. The conceptualized self is typically descriptive. So I'm a woman. I look a certain way. This is my height. I'm certain. I have a certain sort of degree and qualification. All that is descriptive. Okay. You have that descriptive piece, and then you have an evaluative piece. I'm a sick person with depression. I'm a loser. I don't play well. I don't do something well. These are all evaluative aspects. So the descriptive and evaluative makes up the conceptualized self. The problem is that the evaluative component is a threat to psychological flexibility. Once I define and evaluate myself, and I'm constantly evaluating myself, then I'm feeling very constricted. I'm not being psychologically flexible anymore. Like difficult thoughts threaten one's sense of self. So then I have difficult thoughts. So if I say, I'm good at chess, and then like I lose really badly, then difficult. So I'm a loser thought can threaten my sense of self. And trying to build an accurate self description is actually next to impossible. And let me say that again, trying to build an accurate self description, this is me and full and final, is actually impossible. Instead, if we alter the context, the process within which we relate to our thoughts, we can arrive at psychological flexibility. What I'm feeling right now, who am I showing up as right now? That's all is accessible, right? A transcended sense of self is built into verbal human beings that can be assessed through diffusion and mindfulness processes. So this is a transcendent self is actually, it's in many other sort of psychological language, it's also called metacognition. The ability to see myself, the ability to look at myself and see who am I being right now, and does that work for me in this moment? That is called the self as context. So the more you do thought diffusion exercises, the more you introduce mindfulness processes, mindfulness based exercises of being in the present moment, noticing what is happening in the body, in the right now, right? These are all informal and formal practices of mindfulness. A sense of self as context begins to build. Okay. This is a cool technique for sense of self as context, right? So I'm going to ask you to lift your hand, right? As you sort of lift your hand all the way up, I want you to say, I can't possibly lift my hand. 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 Right? And you notice that you've actually lifted your hand, right? Instead of, in spite of saying, I can't possibly lift my hand. Right? Then what self actually helped you lift your hand? Right? So we talk about this sort of self that is beyond just this sort of talking everyday self. There's another metaphor called the chessboard metaphor, and it's a beautiful metaphor. It talks about how it packs actually several core aspects of aspects of ACT into one. So the chessboard metaphor is that you have a board of chess. You have these white pieces and the black pieces. You're looking at one black piece and you're saying that one black piece, no, it has to go away from my life. Then I can start playing chess really well. Yeah. But actually, chess is played with that black piece and all those other black pieces that you're not currently seeing, and equally present, equal numbers of white pieces that are present, right? And you need all pieces in place to start a game of chess. You're not going to have one piece taken out in order to start playing a game of chess, right? And what you want to be and who you want to be is actually the chess board itself, right? That holds both black pieces and white pieces, right? So the chess board itself is a metaphor for self as context. So who am I showing up as in this moment, and what can I hold on to in this present moment? So that transcendent self, or that metacognitive self, is what ACT is also trying to sort of help you connect with in the use of these metaphors, as well as in practicing mindfulness as an exercise itself. Now, being in the present moment, two primary sources of interference with being present, right? What is coming in the way of being present? Fusion and avoidance, right? The more I'm married to certain thoughts, certain experiences, wanting certain internal experiences to go away, I am constantly avoiding and not accepting what is in the present moment, right? So those two aspects. So when if I'm able to work with avoidance, and if I'm able to work with cognitive diffusion, then coming back to the present moment is actually quite simple as a process. Now we looked at how that hexaflex works, right? They're all connected to one another. So you start working on fusion, you start working on acceptance or avoidance, you start to all these other aspects of ACT will start opening up as well. So upon working on diffusion and acceptance, being present is further made possible. Exposure techniques not to reduce symptoms, but in service of greater vitality and psychological flexibility is encouraged. Now, what does that mean? This exercise I got my client to do, right? This exercise where I said, where is anxiety showing up when you think about going into the room and presenting? They spoke about sort of this, my hands, right? Like there are these sort of tingling and extremely uncomfortable experience showing up in my hands, in my limbs, and pit in my stomach. So when I say, what does it mean to just have those sensations in this moment? As you breathe deeply, as you're breathing, just allowing yourself to have the sensations here, right now, in the room with me, right? We're not saying you're going to do that out in the meeting hall. With me, can we have you open into? So that's an exposure technique. But the exposure technique is not in service of reducing symptoms. It's in service of noticing what is happening in the present moment, so that I can continue to have that experience. And yet, where my focus is on is towards that thing that I need to do to work towards my goal, right? Whatever is my goal, right? So, in service of greater vitality and psychological flexibility. Okay. So there are lots of informal mindfulness practices, folks. I'm going to encourage, we're going to do a couple of them in DBT, so I'm not going to get into it right now. But, if you're interested, SoundCloud, Pulse of Perspective SoundCloud account has a lot of short informal practices that you can look at, and you can also introduce to your clients if you're interested. Now, the other piece is called connecting with values. Now, this is the piece which is very similar to the Ivy's reflection of meaning, as well as narrative inquiry, where we are looking at reauthoring conversations. Okay, connecting with values. Clients are challenged to consider what they want in their life and what they want their life to stand for in different life domains, such as career, family, intimate relationships, friendships, personal growth, health, and spirituality. So there is a sheet actually that is also provided. I can actually share some of these sheets with you. There is a sheet called the bullseye sheet, and it's basically a circle with each of these sort of pies divided. So there's a pie on career, pie on family, intimate relationships, friendship, personal growth, health, and spirituality. And then because it's a bullseye, right? What it asks you to do is that mark where you're at in your life within all these spheres. And then what do you need to do to move closer to the bullseye, right? What is at the bullseye in each of these pies, and what might you need to do to move towards the bullseye, right? So here, as a behavior therapy, ACT focuses on building a vital, purposeful life, and values function as the compass headings in building an effective set of life patterns, right? So the focus for ACT is that, you're working on acceptance, you're working on diffusion, you're working on self as a transcendent self, you're working on present moment. For what? You're working on it to move towards what is really important for you, right? So there is this great going to the fair metaphor. The metaphor essentially states that, you have you decide to go to this fair that is up on a hill, and you're really excited. Let's say you're going to the Numaish, right? And there is your neighbor that says, you know what, the kids, I have two kids, you know this, right? Like, these two kids need to go to the Numaish, their father is waiting for them, can you please take these kids? And these kids are horrible, right? Like, they're little bullies, and they're very mean to you. They keep actually throwing stones at you when the parents are not there. These are mean kids. And then you're thinking, oh my God, if I have to take them to the fair, it's going to be really hard. I don't want to take them. But you see the poor mother's face and you realize, right, she must be more stressed out than you. Okay, you decide, fine, I'll take the kids to the fair. And off you are, sort of driving to the fair, and these kids are horrible as expected. They start sort of spitting at you. They say these mean and wild things, and they say, and they threaten you also. If you drop us here, then I'm going to tell my mother that such a horrible person that you abused us, right? So, so these kids are horrible, and here you are. You can't drive. You're trying to drive, and here you are, sort of decided, okay, wait, I'll stop at the curb. I'll wait for these unruly children to calm down, and I'll drive to the fair then. But you know that when you stop by the curb, these kids are only going to get worse, right? So essentially, the ACT metaphor says, here you are stopped at the curb thinking that these two kids will stop, and they're not going to stop. So there you are at the curb, waiting to go where you really want, but stuck at the moment, right? And the only way is actually to drive the damn car to the fair, right? So again, ACT metaphor is about saying, you're going to have anxiety and depression and difficult experiences present, right? And there is a way to deal with unruly children. Their mother was dealing with them, and mother actually loves these children to bits. So really, there is a way to work with these children as you drive towards the fair. But you can't stop at the curb and say, okay, you know what? Once this goes away, then I will drive to the life that I want really. Right? So ACT says that these negative internal events will keep happening. We can't stop by at the curb expecting that they will go away. Then we're already engaging in push, right? We don't want it, and we're engaging in sort of that non-acceptance, and that essentially is not a workable agenda. Okay. All right. So I spoke about the bullseye technique. There are again other sort of pen and paper techniques that I can send you folks if you're interested in. The last piece is the commitment piece, right? Time check. Okay. Values provide the compass, and commitment provides the walking, right? So here is where you use traditional behavior therapy methods, which you will be learning about tomorrow a little bit, such as exposure, social skills training, behavior activation, and so forth, that helps build patterns of action over time. So value is the compass and commitment is the walking. So once you set up these values, it is about sort of taking the steps, willingness to take the steps to move towards a committed way of life. So they talk about outside willingness versus inside willingness and acceptance. What we are looking at here is internal willingness. We're saying, okay, I'm willing to have this difficult experience, right? Willingness to experience difficult events. Deep of faith with 100% willingness, and choosing to be willing again and again and again. All right. Now, in terms of therapy, the way that people enter into these core processes, you might start with confronting the agenda. right? The control agenda, work towards acceptance, work towards cognitive diffusion, acceptance, self as context, and valuing it as a choice. Typically, how I do it is I work with acceptance, cognitive diffusion. Sometimes I'm isolatedly working on self as context, and valuing as a choice is definitely an important piece in my work with my clients. So, what is the essential ACT question? Number one, given a distinction between you and the stuff you are you willing to have that stuff fully and without defense as it is and not as what it says it is, and do what it takes and do what takes you in the direction of your chosen values at this time in this situation? If the answer is yes, you are a psychologically flexible individual. Now, this is the piece which is an excellent case conceptualization piece. So, if you're interested, you can take a picture of this and work towards looking at what are experiential avoidances clients have, what are some of the ways in which cognitive fusion is happening in the client's narrative, how, in what ways are they attached and married to a sense of self. This is me, how can this happen to me? That's an attached conceptualized self. How are they not in the present moment, and in what ways are they in their past and future? What kind of lack of values clarity is present, and in what ways are they not taking action, in are impulsive or avoidant? You write that down, all these down. This is a brilliant conceptualization sheet. Once you do this, then working on cognitive diffusion or any other intervention strategy will be a lot of fun. Just an overview. We have some great books at pause if you're interested. But that's that.